Okay, hello. Welcome to your first podcast on the joints of the body. In this podcast, we're just going to introduce the three main types of joints to you: cartilaginous joints, fibrous joints, and synovial joints. And then synovial joints are pretty complex, and there's a bunch of different types. So there'll be a second podcast just on the different synovial joints. So I recommend that you follow along with me in your notes and Notability. And if you can, split screen with this podcast. On this slide, you should have a link to a video. It's a TED Ed video about why joints pop. While this is not necessarily part of your test in any way, it is just kind of a very interesting thing if you're a knuckle cracker as to why that actually happens in your knuckles or your joints. Okay, so first let's just talk about what a joint actually is. So a joint is where two or more bones meet with each other. A lot of times you'll hear me call them articulations. So articulations is where two or more bones come together, also referred to as a joint. Okay, our first type of joint are known as fibrous joints. Fibrous joints are bones that are united by fibrous connective tissue. These joints are extremely protective. So the first example of a fibrous joint is the sutures of your skull. Obviously, that is going to be a very protective joint. There is no movement in the sutures of the skull once they have fully sutured. So fibrous joints are going to have no movement, if you want to add that too. No movement. Okay. Another fibrous joint is the syndesmoses, which are between parallel bones. Okay, so an example is right here between your tibia and fibula. There is a syndesmosis, which is a fibrous joint, again, holding those two bones. So again, this type of joint, there is no movement within it. Okay, and then the second type of joint for this podcast is known as a cartilaginous joint. And a cartilaginous joint is when the bone ends are connected by cartilage. So some examples of this would be the ribs and the sternum. The ribs are connected to the sternum in some locations by a piece of cartilage. So this would be a cartilaginous joint. The intervertebral discs that you have between your vertebrae are cartilaginous joints. And then the joint that forms between your two coxal bones, the pubis symphysis, is also a cartilaginous joint. And in terms of movement for this, if there is any movement, it's very little movement. Okay, if any. Okay, the third type of joint of our body is known as a synovial joint. And a synovial joint are probably the joints you think about when you think about joints. These are our freely movable joints. These are the ones that are in our limbs that allow us to move very freely. And synovial joints have some special features that make them different than the other joints. So the first thing that a synovial joint has is called articular or hyaline cartilage. You should remember this from Unit 2 when we talked about cartilage being on the ends of bones when we looked at the cow femur. So cartilage is going to line the ends of the bones at synovial joints, which helps to reduce the friction and keep the joint very freely moving. Another feature of a synovial joint is the fibrous articular capsule. The fibrous capsule, which you can see here, is going to surround the space in between the two bones at the synovial joint and help to protect it. The next feature of a synovial joint is the joint cavity, which is going to be the space in between the two bones. And within it, it has a lubricating synovial fluid. And that helps keeps the joints, again, lubricated, free of friction, and helps protect them and being able to move freely. And then the last feature of synovial joints is the reinforcing ligaments, which you can see um, in a few places in this picture. So those reinforcing ligaments are going to help to prevent the joint from moving too far and dislocating. Now you can see if you look at the picture that there are actually different types of synovial joints, and podcast number 2 will get into the different ones, but you can see there's multi-axial synovial joints. An example would be your shoulder, and can move in many directions. A uniaxial synovial joint, like your elbow, which means it can move in really just one direction. And then a biaxial joint, which means it can move in two directions. Okay, thank you so much for watching this podcast on the joints of the body. You can do your practice activity now, and then make sure you watch the second podcast, which will go into more detail on synovial joints.